Jar Jar Sith. The theory that Jar Jar Binks was secretly a Sith Lord, manipulating events throughout the Star Wars prequel trilogy. Fans spent years analyzing supposed evidence that the clumsy Gungan was actually a Force-sensitive mastermind hiding in plain sight. They pointed to his acrobatic combat movements during the Battle of Naboo, his inexplicable influence over Padme Amidala's decisions, and hand gestures that seemed to coincide with characters changing their minds. The theory gained massive traction on Reddit in 2015, with thousands of fans convinced that George Lucas had planned a dramatic reveal that never happened due to Jar Jar's negative reception. Some theorists even claimed Ahmed Best's physical performance included subtle manipulations that only made sense if Jar Jar was using Jedi mind tricks. The theory became so widespread that it reached Lucas himself, who directly denied it in multiple interviews, confirming that Jar Jar was simply comic relief that didn't land as intended. Lucasfilm representatives have repeatedly stated there was never any plan for Jar Jar to be revealed as anything other than what he appeared to be. The theory represents one of the internet's most elaborate attempts to retroactively fix a disliked character by making him secretly brilliant. Ferris is imaginary. The Fight Club-inspired theory that Ferris Bueller doesn't actually exist and is instead Cameron Fry's imagined alter ego. Theorists argued that Ferris represents everything Cameron wishes he could be, confident and carefree and universally loved. They pointed to how Ferris rarely interacts with people outside Cameron and Sloane, how his schemes always seem to work perfectly, and how the entire day off feels like wish fulfillment for a depressed teenager. The theory suggested that Cameron invented Ferris to cope with his anxiety and his controlling father, with the entire adventure being Cameron's fantasy about breaking free from his constraints. Fans noted that Ferris breaks the fourth wall, which could indicate he exists on a different plane of reality than other characters. John Hughes directly addressed this theory before his death in 2009, confirming that Ferris Bueller is absolutely a real character within the film's universe. Hughes explained that Ferris's seemingly magical ability to avoid consequences was intentional commentary on high school social hierarchies, not evidence of his non-existence. The theory fundamentally misunderstood Hughes's filmmaking style, which often included heightened reality and wish fulfillment without requiring supernatural explanations. Grease Dream Theory. The disturbing theory that Sandy drowns at the beginning of Grease and the entire second half of the film is her dying dream. The theory hinges on the opening scene where Danny describes saving Sandy from drowning during their summer romance, with theorists claiming she actually died in that moment. They argued that everything after the beach represents Sandy's oxygen-deprived brain, creating a fantasy where she gets Danny back, becomes popular, and literally flies away with him at the end in a car. Fans pointed to the increasingly surreal nature of the film's finale, with the flying car serving as Sandy ascending to heaven. The theory suggested that all the other characters and musical numbers are Sandy's subconscious processing her death through the lens of high school fantasies she'll never experience. Randall Kleiser, the film's director, has directly debunked this interpretation multiple times, explaining that the flying car was simply a whimsical ending inspired by magical realism and 1950s optimism. The film was always intended as a straightforward musical love story, not a meditation on death and dying hallucinations. The theory's popularity says more about the internet's tendency to darken light-hearted stories than about Grease's actual intentions. Aladdin Timeline Theory. The theory claiming that Aladdin takes place thousands of years in the future, after an apocalyptic event destroys modern civilization. Theorists pointed to the genie's knowledge of modern pop culture, including his Robin Williams impressions of 20th century celebrities and his references to contemporary phrases. They argued that the genie must have been imprisoned after modern times, meaning Agrabah is actually a post-apocalyptic society that has regressed to medieval technology. Some versions of the theory suggested the Cave of Wonders contains pre-apocalyptic artifacts, and that the magic in the film is actually advanced technology survivors no longer understand. Fans claimed this explained why the genie recognizes Jack Nicholson and Arsenio Hall, despite the film's Arabian Nights setting. Disney officially debunked this theory, explaining that the genie's anachronistic references were simply comedic choices meant to showcase Robin Williams' improvisational talents. The directors confirmed in DVD commentary that Genie exists outside normal time as a cosmic entity, which is why he knows about the future, not because he lived through modern times. The theory emerged from overthinking what were clearly meant as winking jokes for adult audiences watching a children's film. Pixar-connected universe. The massively detailed theory that every Pixar film exists within a single shared universe on one specific timeline. John Negroni published a comprehensive theory in 2013, arguing that Pixar movies tell a multi-generational story spanning thousands of years, from Brave's medieval magic through modern-day stories to Wall-E's distant future. The theory claimed that Boo from Monsters, Inc. grows up to become the witch in Brave, that the by-and-large corporation from Wall-E appears in other films, and that sentient toys, cars, and fish all result from pollution and magic combining in specific ways. Negroni connected dozens of Easter eggs and background details into an elaborate chronology that required multiple apocalypses and the evolution of animal intelligence. The theory went viral and became one of the most famous fan theories ever created, with millions of people convinced Pixar had been planting clues for decades. Pixar animators and directors have repeatedly debunked this theory, explaining that Easter eggs are simply fun references and inside jokes between films, not evidence of shared continuity. Pete Docter confirmed in interviews that each film's creative team operates independently without coordinating some grand universe plan. Lee Unkrich stated that while they enjoy fan theories, Pixar films are intentionally standalone stories that don't require homework to understand. The theory represents impressive creative thinking, but attributes intentionality to what are simply friendly nods between filmmaking teams. Titanic door math. The endlessly debated theory that Jack Dawson could have survived by climbing onto the floating door with Rose. For over 2 decades, fans have argued that the wooden panel was clearly large enough for both characters, with many claiming Rose selfishly let Jack die. The theory gained so much traction that Mythbusters tested it in 2012, demonstrating that 2 people could physically fit on the door's surface. However, James Cameron has explained repeatedly that the issue was never about space, but about buoyancy and weight distribution. Cameron confirmed that if both characters had climbed on, the door would have sunk low enough that both would have died from hypothermia in the freezing Atlantic water. He conducted his own tests during production, trying various configurations to find what would realistically keep Rose alive while Jack perished. Cameron stated in a 2017 interview that the door's buoyancy could only support one person above the lethal waterline. Given the door's thickness and the character's combined weight, the film actually shows Jack trying to climb on before realizing it won't work, a detail many fans overlook. The theory persists because audiences emotionally want Jack to survive, leading them to ignore the physics Cameron carefully researched. By the way, if you're enjoying this, I post videos like this all the time. A subscription would really help out. Inception's ending. The widespread theory that Dom Cobb is still dreaming at the end of Inception because the spinning top doesn't clearly fall. Fans obsessed over the final shot showing Cobb's totem spinning before the film cuts to black, arguing this proves he never escaped the dream world. Theorists analyzed the scene frame by frame, debating whether the top wobbles slightly, suggesting it might fall, or spins perfectly, indicating Cobb remains trapped. Some versions claimed the entire film after a certain point is a dream, while others argued Cobb has been dreaming since the opening scene. The theory spawned countless YouTube videos and online debates about what Nolan intended audiences to believe. Christopher Nolan has addressed this theory multiple times, explaining that the ambiguity is intentional, but that fans miss the actual point of the ending. Nolan stated in interviews that the important detail is Cobb walking away from the top without waiting to see if it falls, showing he's chosen to accept his reality regardless of objective truth. The director confirmed that whether Cobb is dreaming doesn't matter, because he's finally moved past his obsession with determining what's real. Michael Caine, who plays Miles, revealed that Nolan told him any scene he appears in is reality, which would make the ending definitively real. The theory represents audiences getting so caught up in the puzzle that they miss the emotional resolution Nolan actually cared about. James Bond codename. The long-standing theory that James Bond is not one person, but a codename passed between different agents, explaining why Bond's appearance and personality change between actors. Theorists argued this made logical sense for a spy organization, pointing to how Bond seems to age inconsistently and how different actors portray vastly different versions of the character. The theory gained credibility because it elegantly explained casting changes and continuity issues, like how Bond in the 60s has different gadgets than Bond in the 2000s. Fans noted references to Bond's dead wife in multiple eras, questioning how the same person could experience these events across 60 years. Some versions suggested 007 is a designation that gets reassigned when agents die or retire, with each new Bond receiving the same cover identity. However, multiple films directly contradict this theory through explicit continuity. In On Her Majesty's Secret Service, from 1969, George Lazenby's Bond visits his office and examines gadgets from previous films, referencing his own past missions. Skyfall from 2012 shows Bond's childhood home and his parents' graves, both marked with the name Bond, confirming it's his real family name. The film also features M's will leaving Bond a bulldog, demonstrating personal continuity. Barbara Broccoli, longtime producer of the franchise, has directly stated that James Bond is one character, not a codename, and that each actor simply portrays the same man at different points in his career. Gandalf's eagles. The persistent theory questioning why the Fellowship didn't simply fly the ring to Mordor using the Great Eagles, supposedly exposing a massive plot hole. Fans have argued for decades that the Eagles could have flown Frodo directly to Mount Doom, avoiding the entire dangerous journey and making the trilogy unnecessary. The theory claims Tolkien either overlooked this obvious solution or wrote himself into a corner he couldn't escape. Various versions suggest the Eagles refused to help, were too proud, or were simply a plot device Tolkien used inconsistently. Some fans even created elaborate justifications for why the Eagles couldn't help, essentially writing explanations Tolkien supposedly forgot to include. However, Tolkien actually provided multiple clear reasons within the text itself why eagle transit was impossible. The Nazgul on their fell beast would have intercepted any aerial approach to Mordor, as explicitly shown when they attacked the eagles at the Black Gate. Sauron's eye constantly watches the skies around Mordor, and a giant eagle carrying the ring would be immediately visible, destroying the stealth approach that was the quest's only chance of success. Tolkien's letters explain that the eagles are not servants or a taxi service, but proud, intelligent beings who help only when they choose and who cannot safely approach Sauron's territory. The entire thematic point of Lord of the Rings is that small, overlooked heroes succeed where great powers fail, which flying directly to the volcano would completely undermine. The eagles do appear at the end because Sauron has been defeated and his anti-air capabilities destroyed, making aerial rescue finally possible. The theory reflects surface-level thinking about a carefully constructed story with clear internal logic. Tarantino universe split. The theory that Quentin Tarantino's films exist in two separate but connected universes, one called Realer Than Real and the other Movie. Theorists claim that films like Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction happen in a slightly heightened reality, while Kill Bill and Inglourious Basterds occur in the fantasy movies that exist within that reality. The theory attempted to explain tonal differences and stylistic variations between Tarantino's more grounded crime films and his more outlandish revenge fantasies. Fans pointed to character connections, like the Vega brothers appearing in different films, as evidence of this split timeline structure. They argued it explained why some films feel relatively realistic, while others include cartoonish violence and impossible scenarios. Tarantino himself addressed and rejected this theory in interviews, explaining that all his films simply exist in a stylized version of reality where his aesthetic rules apply. He confirmed that the Vega brothers connection is just a fun detail, not evidence of some master universe plan. Tarantino stated he doesn't think about his filmography as requiring complex continuity explanations, and that each film is primarily standalone, with occasional playful connections. The director has said he enjoys fan theories, but that people overcomplicate what is essentially him making the kinds of movies he wants to watch, with style choices varying based on genre rather than some metaphysical universe structure. The Shining conspiracy. The elaborate conspiracy theory claiming Stanley Kubrick's The Shining is actually a confession that he helped fake the Apollo moon landing footage. The theory, prominently featured in the documentary Room 237 from 2012, argues that Kubrick embedded symbols and clues throughout the film admitting his involvement in the supposed hoax. Theorists point to Danny's Apollo 11 sweater, the impossible window in the manager's office, the change room number from King's novel, and alleged visual references to rocket launches. Some versions claim the government forced Kubrick to fake moon footage, and that he used The Shining to safely reveal the truth through symbolic imagery. Conspiracy theorists analyze carpet patterns, typewriter brands, and even the length of specific scenes, claiming they correspond to moon mission details. The theory interprets literally everything in the film through this lens, turning a ghost story into a coded government confession. However, the entire premise collapses under basic scrutiny of production history and Kubrick's actual working methods. Kubrick's daughter Catherine has directly denied the theory, calling it insulting to her father's legacy and stating he was obsessively focused on adapting Stephen King's novel, not planting conspiracy messages. Production documents and crew interviews confirmed that design choices had aesthetic and thematic purposes related to the horror story, not hidden moon landing meanings. The Apollo sweater was simply a popular children's clothing item in the 70s, not a secret message. Kubrick was famously meticulous about realism in his space film 2001, which actually makes him an unlikely candidate for faking moon footage. The theory represents conspiratorial thinking, projecting meaning onto an artist's work that was never intended. Totoro death theory. The dark theory claiming that Satsuki and Mei in My Neighbor Totoro are actually dead or dying throughout most of the film. The theory originated in Japan in the early 2000s, arguing that the girls drown or die somehow early in the movie, and that Totoro is a death spirit guiding them to the afterlife. Theorists pointed to a scene where the girls lose their shadows, supposedly indicating they've become ghosts, and noted the hospital setting as evidence of death themes. Some versions claimed the entire forest adventure is the girls' dying hallucination as they succumb to illness or injury. The theory interpreted Totoro's appearances as death omens and suggested the ending where they visit their mother is actually them visiting her as spirits before moving on. Fans spread the theory widely online, with many accepting it as a legitimate interpretation of Hayao Miyazaki's intentions. Studio Ghibli officially responded to the theory on their website, explicitly denying it and stating that the shadow detail was simply an animation choice to lighten the scene's mood, not indicate the characters had died. Miyazaki himself has confirmed in interviews that Totoro is a nature spirit representing childhood wonder, not a death god. The studio explained that their films are meant to be uplifting celebrations of childhood and nature, not hidden tragedy stories. Production notes reveal the film was partially inspired by Miyazaki's own childhood and his desire to create a comforting story for children, directly contradicting the death interpretation. The theory reflects a common internet tendency to impose dark readings onto children's media, regardless of creator intent. E.T. Star Wars. The theory that E.T. the Extraterrestrial and Star Wars exist in the same universe, connected through a single background detail. Fans pointed to the Halloween scene where Elliot passes a child dressed as Yoda, and E.T. seems to recognize him, stumbling forward and reaching out. Theorists argued this proves E.T.'s species and the Star Wars galaxy are connected, with some suggesting E.T. traveled from the Star Wars universe to Earth. The theory expanded to claim that E.T.'s species appears in the Phantom Menace during the Senate scene, showing representatives that look similar to E.T., supposedly confirming the connection. Some versions suggested that E.T.'s ability to levitate objects proves he's force-sensitive and comes from the Star Wars galaxy. Steven Spielberg and George Lucas have both explained that the supposed connection is simply a friendly Easter egg joke between director friends, not evidence of shared continuity. Spielberg intentionally included a child in a Yoda costume to reference Lucas's films, and Lucas later returned the favor by including E.T. like aliens in The Phantom Menace as a playful nod to Spielberg. Neither director intended audiences to believe the universes actually connect canonically. The cross-references are simply inside jokes and mutual appreciation between filmmakers, a common practice in Hollywood. The theory takes a light-hearted homage far too literally, mistaking friendly references for world-building. Willy Wonka cereal. The theory that Willy Wonka deliberately murdered children throughout the factory tour in the 1971 film. Theorists argued that each child's accident was actually planned by Wonka, who designed deadly traps disguised as whimsical attractions. They claimed Augustus Gloop drowning in chocolate, Violet Beauregard inflating, Veruca Salt falling down the garbage chute, and Mike Teavee being shrunk were all intentional eliminations. Some versions suggested Wonka was selecting an heir through a sadistic death tournament, with Charlie winning by being the only survivor. Fans pointed to Wonka's calm reactions to each disaster, and the Oompa Loompas' pre-prepared songs as evidence he planned everything. The theory painted Wonka as a serial killer, using his factory as an elaborate murder house. However, Roald Dahl's original book and the film's actual text make clear that each child suffers consequences for their misbehavior, not death, and that Wonka's factory is genuinely dangerous, but not intentionally murderous. The film shows all the children alive at the end, with Augustus covered in chocolate, Violet turned blue, Veruca covered in garbage, and Mike stretched tall. These transformations are punishments and dark humor, consistent with Dahl's style of teaching moral lessons through exaggerated consequences. Dahl was famous for his darkly comic children's stories, where bratty kids face magical comeuppance, but ultimately survive to learn their lessons. The theory misreads deliberate dark comedy as actual murder plot, taking Dahl's satirical punishment fantasies literally, instead of understanding them as moral fables wrapped in absurdist humor. Frozen Nazi propaganda. The bizarre theory claiming Disney created Frozen specifically to bury internet search results about Walt Disney being cryogenically frozen. The theory suggested that before Frozen's release in 2013, searching Disney Frozen would return articles about the urban legend that Walt Disney's body was frozen after his death in 1966. Theorists argued Disney deliberately made and heavily marketed a movie called Frozen so that searches would instead return results about the film burying the cryogenic story. Some versions suggested this was a corporate conspiracy to protect Disney's image and that the film's success was engineered specifically for this purpose. The theory gained surprising traction online, despite requiring Disney to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a movie just to manipulate search results. However, the timeline completely debunks this theory. Development on Frozen began in the early 2000s, long before search engine optimization became a corporate strategy and when Disney Frozen searches already primarily returned results about the studio's various products. Walt Disney was actually cremated, not frozen, making the entire premise of needing to bury the story pointless, since the legend is completely false anyway. The film's title comes from Hans Christian Andersen's The Snow Queen, which Disney had been trying to adapt since the 1930s, not from some search engine conspiracy. Disney's actual marketing strategy focused on the film's songs, story, and characters, not on dominating search results. The theory represents extreme conspiratorial thinking that attributes absurdly complex motivations to straightforward creative decisions. Danny Torrance theory. The theory that Danny Torrance's psychic powers actually caused the haunting at the Overlook Hotel in The Shining rather than the hotel being genuinely haunted. Theorists argued that Danny's powerful shining ability unconsciously manifests the ghosts and dangers, essentially creating hallucinations that become real. They suggested Jack's descent into madness results from Danny's psychic influence rather than supernatural evil, and that the hotel's history of violence is either exaggerated or brought to life by Danny's presence. Some versions claimed Danny subconsciously drives Jack insane as a manifestation of the boy's fear of his father's alcoholism and past abuse. The theory attempted to provide a psychological rather than supernatural explanation for the film's events. However, Stephen King's novel explicitly establishes the Overlook Hotel as genuinely haunted by malevolent spirits, with a dark history of violence predating Danny's arrival. King confirmed in interviews that the hotel actively seeks Danny because of his shining power, wanting to consume his ability, not that Danny creates the haunting. The novel includes extensive backstory about the hotel's evil nature and previous murders that occurred before the Torrance family arrives. Both Kubrick's film and King's book show the hotel influencing Jack specifically because he's vulnerable due to his alcoholism and anger issues, not because Danny psychically controls him. The shining ability in King's mythology allows people to perceive supernatural forces, not create them. King has stated the story is about alcoholism, family violence, and actual ghosts, rejecting purely psychological interpretations that remove the horror elements. Mace Windu Snoke. The theory that Mace Windu survived his fall from Palpatine's office and eventually became Supreme Leader Snoke in the Star Wars sequel trilogy. Fans argued that Windu's unknown fate left room for him to return as a villain, pointing to Snoke's damaged appearance as evidence of surviving near death. Theorists noted that both characters used Force lightning and purple, Windu's signature color, supposedly connecting them. Some versions suggested Windu's survival and disfigurement drove him insane, turning him to the dark side and leading him to create the First Order. Samuel L. Jackson himself fueled the theory by stating in interviews that he believed Windu survived since audiences never saw a body. Fans calculated that the timeline worked, with enough years between Revenge of the Sith and The Force Awakens for Windu to recover and build a new empire. The theory gained widespread discussion as one of the most plausible ways to bring a beloved character back. However, The Last Jedi definitively killed this theory by revealing Snoke's actual identity and backstory. The film shows Kylo Ren killing Snoke, and subsequent canon materials identified Snoke as an artificial creation of Palpatine, a failed clone used to manipulate Ben Solo. Official guidebooks confirmed Snoke was never meant to be a returning character, but rather a tool in Palpatine's contingency plan. Snoke's use of Force lightning was red, not purple, and his abilities came from being connected to Palpatine, not from being Mace Windu. The theory represented wishful thinking about Jackson returning to Star Wars rather than actual evidence in the films. Pulp Fiction briefcase. The endlessly debated theories about what's inside Marcellus Wallace's briefcase in Pulp Fiction, with interpretations ranging from his soul to Elvis's gold suit. The glowing briefcase contents remain unseen by audiences, leading to decades of speculation. Popular theories suggested the case contained Marcellus's soul, sold to the devil and marked by the bandage on the back of his neck supposedly covering the extraction point. Others claimed it held diamonds from Reservoir Dogs, connecting Tarantino's films. Some theorized it was simply gold or money, while more elaborate versions suggested it contained everything from nuclear material to the Holy Grail. The briefcase's mysterious contents became one of cinema's most famous MacGuffins, with fans analyzing every detail of how characters react when seeing inside. Quentin Tarantino has addressed this repeatedly, confirming that the briefcase intentionally contains nothing specific, and that audiences should never know what's inside. Tarantino explained in interviews that the briefcase is a pure MacGuffin, a plot device that motivates characters, but whose actual contents are irrelevant to the story. He confirmed that the original script simply said a glowing object without specifying what it was because the mystery matters more than any specific answer. Tarantino stated he enjoys fan theories, but that choosing any one explanation would be less interesting than maintaining the ambiguity. The glow was created using a hidden light bulb, a simple filming technique with no deeper meaning. The theory debates miss the point that Tarantino deliberately made the contents meaningless, using the briefcase purely as motivation for character actions without needing to justify what makes it valuable. Groundhog Day duration. The various theories calculating exactly how long Phil Connors remains trapped in the time loop in Groundhog Day, with estimates ranging from 10 years to 10,000 years. Fans obsessively analyzed every skill Phil acquires, including piano mastery, ice sculpting expertise, medical knowledge, and deep familiarity with Punxsutawney's residents. Some theorists calculated that becoming a concert-level pianist alone would require at least 10 years of daily practice, then added years for each additional skill. Other versions suggested Phil needed thousands of years to memorize every detail of everyone's lives and to reach his final level of enlightenment and selflessness. The most extreme theories propose 10,000 days based on how many activities Phil performs and relationships he develops. Film scholars debated whether Phil's transformation required decades or centuries to feel earned. However, director Harold Ramis provided an official answer in multiple interviews, stating that he and writer Danny Rubin calculated Phil spent approximately 30 to 40 years in the loop. Ramis explained they worked backward from the skills Phil demonstrates to determine a realistic time frame, settling on about 10,000 days as the intended duration. The director confirmed this was long enough for Phil to master his abilities and completely transform as a person without being so long that his sanity wouldn't survive. Ramos noted the specific number wasn't important to the film's themes about personal growth and living each day meaningfully. The various fan calculations, while creative, overcomplicated what Ramos and Rubin had already determined during production. Mad Max timeline. The theory that the Mad Max films are actually stories told and embellished by the feral kid from The Road Warrior, explaining continuity errors and inconsistencies. Theorists pointed to the feral kid's narration at the end of The Road Warrior, suggesting all the films are his unreliable retellings of Max's adventures. The theory attempted to explain why Max's car and dog appear in multiple films, despite being destroyed, why Max's history seems to change, and why the timeline feels inconsistent. Fans argued this justified the escalating weirdness of the franchise, with each film growing more exaggerated as stories get embellished over time. Some versions suggested different characters are telling different stories, with Fury Road being a separate legend entirely. The theory gained popularity as an elegant solution to apparent plot holes and continuity issues fans noticed. However, George Miller has directly addressed this, explaining that Mad Max films intentionally have loose continuity because they're modern mythology, not realistic historical documents. Miller stated in interviews that he views the films as existing in a kind of mythic space where exact continuity matters less than the archetypal story being told. He confirmed that the feral kid's narration frames only The Road Warrior, not the entire series. Miller has said he doesn't worry about making the films perfectly consistent because Max is meant to be a legendary wanderer whose exact history is less important than what he represents. The director intentionally creates each film to stand alone while maintaining thematic and character consistency rather than strict continuity. The theory complex explanation onto what Miller deliberately made flexible for creative freedom. If you found this valuable, subscribe so you never miss new content. Appreciate you watching.